Okay, so we are jumping back into The Virtue of Selfishness, written by Ayn Rand. And today I thought we'd look at this concept that I think is very important. The namesake of the show is what is money? One of the immediate questions beneath that I think is even more confounding is what is value? Something that we all talk about a lot. We talk about the importance of it. We have personally held values. We try to create value in the world. We denominate economic value in money, and it's how we determine what enterprises are satisfying the wants of humans versus not. And it's something very closely related to action. So I'd like to just peer into Rand's mind about how she defines value. And I'll read just a small excerpt here to get us started. And she writes that value is that which one acts to gain and or keep. The concept of value is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. It presupposes an entity capable of acting to achieve a goal in the face of an alternative. Where no alternative exists, no goals and no values are possible. So this is, something that's very important. Value seems to be that which guides human action, and human action is what we're dealing with in almost every circumstance of life.
Sure. So, value is that which one acts to gain or keep. So the value is, in a sense, human wants, are the wants of an individual, but not just a want, right? I can want a Ferrari. There's a big poster on my wall, but I never do anything to get one. I never try to get a job and try to make a lot of money and try to pursue that. Then it's not really a value. It's more of a fantasy. A value is something that I act to gain, or if I already have, that I act to preserve it, I act to keep it. Right? So your values manifest themselves through your actions, right? So I can if I observe Robert over a period of time, right, I'll be able to say, at least to some extent, what are your values? What do you think is important? What are you trying to attain? What are you trying to achieve? What's important to you through your actions, right? So that's how she's defining value. She's not saying here good values versus bad values, because there could be values that are destructive versus values that are productive. That is kind of another level, right? This is at a very basic level that all human beings act to gain or keep things. All human beings have values. And then we can talk about, well, which one of those values are good, which one of those values are bad. That is kind of a second level to the discussion.
Yeah. And there's in the Austrian economic literature, they talk about, this is the marginalism revolution in the mid 1800s, where they used to think value was objective. There was some elementary particle of util in the world, and this pencil had 70 utils and this wagon had 100, and somehow that caused them to develop a price. And then that was all thrown out, and we said, no, there are no cardinal or objective values. It's all preference, right? It's order of preferences.
Yeah, so this is where it gets complicated, because Ayn Rand believes in objective values, but her definition of objective is different than kind of the conventional view of objective. Objective in this context, it would be that which is appropriate to man. That is that which is appropriate to human beings. Objective for Ayn Rand is not in the thing. That she calls intrinsic, and many people talk about intrinsic value, right? The thing has a value. We might not be able to, it has X amount, just like you said. It has a particular amount. And how do you discover that intrinsic value? Well, it might be through revelation. It might be through some math. It might be but it has a value in and of itself. The subjective view, and here, put aside a little bit the Austrians' use of the word subjective, because I think it's confusing. But the subjective view historically means whatever I feel like it.
Mhm.
I feel like it's worth a lot, then it's worth a lot. I feel like it's worth a little, it's worth a little. So it's really primarily based on just emotion and whim and desire. Objective now means what this is worth to me in the context of my life, using my mind. So rational evaluation of what something is worth to me.
Mhm.
And we know, for example, in the marketplace, there are people who buy and sell stuff on whim, on emotion. They don't usually survive for very long in the marketplace. They don't, but that is subjective. An objective participant in the marketplace tries, as Rand in the quote says, try to figure out what's important to him, to his life, what's objectively that is in reality good for him. So, for example, I might say cocaine is a value in a sense that some people want it, right, and are willing to pay for it, and it gives them a high, and they want it. But I'd say that is subjective, because nobody actually thinks about it. Nobody actually puts the time to really think about it, actually views cocaine as good for them, as something to be gained or kept. So cocaine as a value only to those who've given up on their mind. So an objective assessment would say, no, for human beings, cocaine is not a value. Even though that guy might pursue it, even though that might think it is, it's not really objectively a value. And in the sense that they kind of two meanings of value. One is whatever people want, complete free fall. And the other is whatever an objective value is, whatever people want, that is also appropriate, objectively appropriate, suited, consistent with reality.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So Rand is using the term intrinsic to indicate something that is intrinsic to the object, external. She's using objective to say what's in accordance with life or reason.
Exactly.
And subjective would be something more of just an immediate want of some kind.
Yeah, and the Austrians flip on this. I mean, Menger, the original Austrian, was very much, I think, had, when he talked about value, had very much Ayn Rand's perspective on value. Menger was the most Aristotelian of all the Austrians. Unfortunately, Mises is much more Kantian. But Menger was very Aristotelian, and he had this. When you read Menger, he has this view of value, and I think it's implicit in really the whole Austrian theory of economics. It's this idea of it's not just whatever I feel like, whatever I want, but it is what actually helps me achieve my goals, the next value, the value higher up in the hierarchy of values, because values are on a hierarchy, the more important ones, the less important ones. So I don't think objectivism in Austrian economics, particularly as Austrian economics is understood by its founders, by, I'd say, Menger, von Barweg, and Mises, I don't think there's a fundamental contradiction between objectivism or conflict between objectivism and that version of Austrian economics.
Right. I actually agree with that, but I've identified something here that I think might be a circularity between the two, and I'd like to just try to parse it with you. So Rand is saying value is that which one acts to gain or keep. So in that definition, it seems like value is the aim of action. But as the Austrians describe, and my understanding is that we all have this internal hierarchy of values. Whatever we're doing in a moment, whatever action we're taking is an expression of the highest value by definition. So it seems like Rand's definition is like value is what action's oriented toward. And perhaps the Austrian definition is all action is an expression of value. So I'm trying to understand the directionality of value and action here.
So this is where I think the Austrians are economists, and they're not philosophers. And this is why I always tell people when they read Human Action to skip the first 70 pages, the praxeology part, because I think it's wrong. That view of the Austrians is that we have some implicit set of values and we just act on it.
Mhm.
And Rand assumes that we have free will, that we have the ability to choose our values,
Mhm.
to act on them, to change our values as we go along. But the rational person, the virtuous person, the good person, actually is conscious of his values, plans his values, and goes out and pursues those values. And we can identify those values by how they act, and the action is ultimately motivated by something that they want to achieve, and those are the values. Right? So it's not the Austrians have a little bit of this notion of action is the first thing. Action is the primary, and for Rand, thought is the primary, and so thinking and evaluating and choosing are the primaries, not acting. Acting is a consequence of all that.
That's
You
really
think before you act, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a blurry domain for me because I'm thinking of, like, if you're engaged in sport or something like that, it's what is the old saying that you fall to the lowest rung of your training or something like that, when
Sure, because you've automatized certain actions,
yes,
right? So you drive a car, you're not conscious. I mean, I learned how to drive on a stick shift, right? You're not conscious of changing the gears. You just change the gears when it's appropriate because you've automatized that behavior. But know that you had to learn it. The same in sport, right? You hit a tennis ball in a particular way, but you've learned that. You've repeated it, and you've got muscle memory. You've got the connection between cognition and muscle. You don't think first and then act because you've already automatized it to such an extent. And yes, if once you've chosen, let's say, once you've chosen to pursue particular values and you found the methodology to do so, if you repeat that methodology often enough, it'll become second nature to you. And indeed, if you at some point decide, you know what, maybe that whole thing is wrong. Maybe I'm like you have to change your swing in tennis, right? It's really, really hard to redo it after you've automatized it. And what process do you have to do in order to change it? You have to think it through. Right. You have to rethink it and re-automatize it. So the thinking is always there. It's just a question of the thinking might have been that I did 5 years ago, and now I'm reaping the benefit from it. But to start a new process, you have to put in the work of actually working it out. It doesn't. Right. There's nothing programmed in us to just tell us how to do it right.
Right. Okay. So yeah, the old saying, can't teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing. Like, it's hard to do.
Well, although you can, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard.
And so with animals, and she gets into this a little bit, but I guess animals just have a lower resolution consciousness than humans then, because they have to learn things too, right? They have to learn how to walk and hunt and whatever, but they can't necessarily consciously reprogram themselves.
They can't at all. So they can learn certain things in some limited scope. Like, think about what human beings can learn. We can learn to go to the moon, right? Yeah. Dogs can't do that, but they can learn, this is a good guy, I don't like that guy, or that guy beat me last time, or whatever. They can learn simple ideas and they can hold them somehow in their mind, but they don't use concepts. They don't deal in abstractions. Right. So they've got low resolution is one way of thinking of it. But it's also, I think animals have a fundamentally different type of consciousness than human beings. And the difference is this issue of free will. Animals don't have free will. Animals, in a sense, are pre-programmed. And their programming, the higher up the animal gets, like ultimately chimpanzees or gorillas, the more options are pre-programmed in them. But they can't do the programming themselves. They can't change their mind, in a sense, and say, no, what I learned last week, that's no good. I'm going to, the only way that would change is if they had a new experience or something in the, they act more like a computer, more like what we call artificial intelligence than human beings. Human beings actually can program themselves, can learn, or, which is uniquely human, we can choose to ignore the programming. We can choose to be stupid. We can choose to commit suicide. We can choose to be irrational. We can choose to go on a bender. Animals can't make those choices that are self-destructive. Only human beings can make choices that are self-destructive.
So that's a very interesting line, because with a human agent involved, they can retrain the dog or the monkey or whatever, but the monkey or the dog can't necessarily choose to retrain itself. But the human can also take that same approach to himself.
Yes.
So is that the dividing line? Is like the ability to step out of oneself, look at one's programming, and retool it? Because everything
one of the dividing lines
being programmed right through life, animals and humans.
Yeah.
But humans have this agency, I guess, to step out.
Humans have agency. That's a big part of it. But the other part of it, because they have agency, they also have the ability to have conceptual knowledge. They also have the ability to abstract.
Right.
And a dog might be able to differentiate between a chair and a sofa, right? He won't have a word for them, but he sees them as different, right? They have different sizes. They have different purposes. Maybe a table is better, a chair and a table. But a dog can't think in terms of furniture. Right? Think about furniture. Furniture is an abstraction. There's no such thing as furniture. You can't point at furniture. You can point at chairs and tables and couches and say a word that combines all these things is furniture. An animal can't do that. They can't rise above the perceptual level. They can't rise above what you can see. Right? So theoretically, you might have a name for everything they see, but they can't integrate those into a higher abstraction, into a greater level of abstraction. And that limits their ability to think, to reason, to to therefore invent things and produce things. And they're stuck. All they'll ever do is the same thing dogs have ever done, right? They're not going to, they're not going to suddenly just, invent a dog machine, because that requires abstract thinking, and that requires that self-programming, right? It requires agency. So animals don't have agency, and they don't have the ability to abstract.
It's really interesting. So the inability of animals to abstract is the dividing line between, well, as she says in here, experience gives you, I hope I'm using the right word here, percepts, but to abstract those percepts into a network of meaning that you can communicate and reconfigure is concepts. That's conceptual. And so that's related to the use of language, right? Because
that leads to use of language. That's right. That's why human beings have language.
Which is worse. So is it we all have percepts, every sentient organism, but then because of language, we can abstract it, or
no. The abstraction, once we abstract, we don't have anything to point at. So we have to capture that abstraction with something. That's a word, right? So we invent, in a sense, language to capture the abstraction.
Right.
Because there's no other way to capture it. So, imagine caveman, I don't know, whatever, hundreds of thousands of years ago, before they have language, they can point to certain things. They can even draw it in midair. But to actually get a word, that becomes necessary once we're talking about an abstraction. Or, for example, once we start planning long term, once I want to tell you, tomorrow we're going to do X. An animal can't say tomorrow we're going to do X. Right. It can only live in the moment. But once you start planning for the future, you're starting to deal with abstractions. You have to have words in order to convey to yourself and to convey to others what you mean by those abstractions. That's when language develops. So language develops. We obviously have the capacity for language inside, in our neurons, but language develops in order to make abstractions possible. Abstractions are not possible without it, and language, of course, is not meaningful without abstractions. So they go hand in hand.
That's really so. The use of language or concepts is equivalent to the discovery of time in a way, right? That we can actually recognize our existence today and think about days ahead and accord our present actions to future situations where animals cannot. Animals are just living in percepts.
So think of time as another big abstraction, right? So what can we concretely know? What's happening right now? We can remember something happening in the past, but the idea of a past the idea of a relationship between a past and a present and a future, that's this amazing abstraction, that somebody discovered at some point and said, hey, we can connect this with a concept called time. And giving it a word, and that word facilitates communication. But that word, more importantly than communication, people overemphasize communication. The most important thing for words is our ability to think. That is, we think in words. So the most important purpose of words is, in a sense, to communicate with ourselves. It's to actually engage in cognition. And of course, the communication is good for that, because we can help each other engage in cognition, and we can support each other in cognition. But the fundamental is to be able to think. And that's what we need language for. We need language in order to think, because we can't hold the abstractions, because there's no picture that presents itself for time.
Right.
It has to be a story. Story requires concepts. Right. Story requires words, right?
So without humans pre-language, we were just in animal percepts, right? I mean, we couldn't string it together.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I don't know exactly how evolution worked out, because it's pretty amazing where we got to. But there clearly is a point in which human beings went from being animals to being more than animals, to being super animals in some way, to having free will and being able to conceptualize. And at some point that happened. Exactly how, what caused it, how can one think of it in terms of evolutionary terms? I don't know. That's way above my pay grade. You'd have to really get an evolutionary biologist, and they'd have to have the right concepts and the right philosophy to really get that right. I think too much of evolutionary psychology today is perverted and distorted by wrong philosophy and by an ignorance of what concepts actually mean.
Interesting. Okay, so I have another question. I want to read an excerpt first, though. So Rand writes, life can be kept in existence only by a constant process of self-sustaining action. The goal of that action, the ultimate value, which, to be kept, must be gained through its every moment, is the organism's life. An ultimate value is that final goal or end to which all lesser values are the means, and it sets the standard by which all lesser goals are evaluated. An organism's life is its standard of value. That which furthers its life is the good. That which threatens it is the evil. So this is very interesting, because she's, what is that old quote that man is the measure of all things? She's framing this that it's all relative to life, right? If it's supporting life, it's good. If it's detrimental to life, it's evil. And then I guess my question here is, in the Austrian school, they distinguish between action and behavior. Behavior being the reflexive animal behavior, right? If you hit your knee with a little hammer and your leg kicks out at the doctor's office, that's a behavior. Versus action is something motivated by purpose or intent. Does she distinguish between action and behavior as well in this respect?
Not really. I mean, because she is interested in the action. She's interested in what we can control. What we can't control, she's not interested in. There's no moral weight. There's no moral weight to things we can't control. That's not moral or not moral. Moral is only that which is chosen. And here she's talking about morality, and that's what's interesting, right? The fact that my knee goes like that, the fact that I have certain things that are not my heartbeats and the certain biological process I can control, that's interesting for biology, but it's not interesting for philosophy. It's not interesting for evaluating human beings and what they should do and how they should act. So for her, the question is ultimately, what value should you choose? And therefore, what should you act to gain and keep? Right? What should you act for? And what she's saying here is that for human beings, for all living beings, put it this way, for all living beings, there is one fundamental alternative that conditions everything. It conditions all their choices. And that is to exist or not to exist. Like a rock doesn't care, right? It's not alive. It has nothing to lose. If you break up a rock, nothing's changed. Nothing really matters, right? Life, which is a self-sustaining, self-directed action. Again, life requires action. Life is movement. The static, the unmovable is not alive, right? A rock is not alive. Things that don't move, that don't act are not alive. If you look at all living beings, they're acting, and they're acting for a purpose. And the purpose is life. The goal is life. It's self-sustaining action, to self-sustain whatever it is that they're doing, right? They're not conscious of it. You know, like an amoeba doesn't have consciousness. And they're not choosing it. It's programmed. But that's a unique construct of molecules that generates this action in order to self-sustain itself. That's what life is. And the fundamental alternative that every living being has is to continue to self-sustain itself or not, or to go out of existence, to die. And, it makes choices in quotes, because animals don't really choose, but it acts in ways that try to perpetuate its life. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes mistakes, and the lion eats you, or the light never shines on this plant and it dies. But the plant tries to stay alive, right? It'll send its roots to look for water. Its leaves will move to try to find the sunlight. It will take actions to try to survive. Sometimes it fails. So all living beings strive to survive. And then the issue with human beings is that uniquely, we don't have survival coded in. We don't have a program that says, here's how you survive. For that matter, we don't even have ultimately coded into us, you must survive. In fact, as human beings commit suicide, animals typically don't. What we have is a mind, a brain that is capable of discovering that which will lead to our survival, the actions that are going to lead to our survival, and it can discover those that can lead to death. And the point she's making is, at the end, life sets the standard for what actions I should take. Pro-life, right? Those are the values I should take, because without life, value is meaningless. Without life, I'm dead. I go out of existence. So the values one should pursue, and the thing that makes values meaningful, values possible, is the idea that you can go in and out of life. If you were, she gives an example in another essay of an immortal robot. If you could, nothing bad could happen to you, then you wouldn't care. Right? There's nothing to strive towards. There's nothing to avoid. There's just existence. Sounds pretty bland and boring. Human beings, at every corner, we face the opportunity of death, and it's something to avoid. And we also face the opportunity of living, and that's what we should strive towards. So it's life that conditions what is good and what is evil, that which promotes life. And here, life for Rand is kind of capital L life. It's not just for human beings. It's not just staying alive. It's living as a human being and everything that entails, right? It's not living as an animal, right? A lot of people, you could argue, live like animals in a sense that they never use their mind. They never create anything. They never think for themselves. They never produce for themselves. They're leeches on others. That's not living. That's dying. Right? So for her, in that sense, life is the standard. It's the ultimate value. It's what everything is geared towards.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. So that we have values that presuppose life, because you can't have values without life. So therefore, life is the ultimate value. What then, okay, in the case of a conflict where, say, a certain action would further one man's interest at the expense of another, right? Coercion, violence, theft, whatever. So that would be materially good for one, but evil to another, the one that's being perpetrated against. Is she categorizing like all human beings as like the life of human beings as an ultimate value? So like, how does she?
No, your life is your ultimate value.
It seems like there's some utilitarian assertion here, which she hasn't gotten into yet. I'm just curious, how does she?
No, she never does. She doesn't. Okay. She doesn't go the utilitarian route. She's saying your life is your ultimate value, and my life is my ultimate value. Mm-hmm. And she would say the only way that each one of us can fully live in each other's company, right, is acknowledging that since violence is bad for me, violence is bad for you, and therefore violence is out. Because even though I could steal your stuff for a variety of reasons, which you can go into, stealing your stuff is not good for me. I mean, I'll give you a few reasons why. Stealing your stuff legitimizes stealing. Some dude who's bigger than me is going to steal my stuff then, and I won't like that, right? Stealing your stuff negates your life. Well, again, that means I've negated mine. Because there is a life it's an ultimate value to me, but it's also an ultimate value to you and everybody else. And if I've negated it, if I've said yours doesn't matter, I basically said mine doesn't matter. Psychologically also, stealing your stuff is a recognition by me that I'm inferior to you. It's a recognition that I can't produce. I can't create. I can't make stuff. I can't take care of myself. My mind is impotent. And the only way I can survive is by leeching off the people who can produce, can create, do have a mind, and can use their mind. Right? So stealing undermines my reason, my purpose, and my self-esteem, which we'll get to, right? But it undermines my self-esteem because it's basically telling me, I'm admitting to myself, I can't make it. I can't survive in reality, but by use of my own mind. And without self-esteem, you can't be happy. And without happiness, you're not really living with a capital L. So to her, violence, any act of violence that's not in self-defense, is an act that admits self-defeat. It's an act that undermines your own values, your own life, and your own ability to live with other people.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So
it's never in your self-interest to initiate force on somebody else. It's not in your self-interest to lie, to be dishonest. In other words, you could imagine scenarios where it's in your self-interest to lie, but those exceptions, it's never appropriate to lie to gain a value. To protect the value, it's sometimes appropriate to lie. But it's never appropriate to steal. It's never appropriate to commit violence against another unless it's in self-defense. Right? So, and all of those are true because it's bad for you. It's not good for you. If you think about human life, not just as like an animal does in the moment, But if you think about human life over that concept we talked about earlier, time, right? And this is the thing that human beings can do. They can plan for the long run. And therefore they can evaluate their life in the context of the long run. And they can say to themselves, yes, right now I might be satisfying my urges or whatever, my needs by stealing. But over the long run, is this good for me? And the conclusion is always, it is not.
Right. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense to me. The theme I'm detecting here is this whole idea: stealing, coercion, violence. These are animalistic behaviors, right? Because you're prioritizing your short run interest over your long run detriment, unavoidably, it seems like. But we have this issue where many people, as you said earlier, they do live unthinkingly, they do live animalistically, non-productively. They just, as she says in the essay here, they follow the ideas of others typically. So should an aim of civilization then be to make stealing, coercion, violence very expensive and or risky?
Definitely. And so two things. One, I'd say is, she would say, they suffer the consequence of their actions. So not everybody who is not living fully is lying, is stealing and committing violence, and therefore needs to be punished. Somebody who's just a leech, somebody who's just never haven't thought for himself, is a complete follower. They live pathetic lives, and that's their punishment, if you will. They just never experience what it's like to be fully human and to really live as a human being. But the people who commit violence, the people who steal, the people who commit fraud, we need a mechanism by which to penalize that. We need a mechanism by which to extract them from human society, so that we can all live our lives without having to constantly carry a gun, constantly worry about those people, attacking us. We need to make it so expensive that either they go away or we put them away, right? That's what prison, that's what a legal system is. And her view is that's pretty much the role of government. That's pretty much all the role of government is. It's to extract violence from society. It's to make society violence free, so that we can engage in the kind of trading activities, and that good people can pursue their values free of the fear and just the inconvenience and the destruction of people who commit violent crimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, all right, the justifiable role of government then would be to make society violence free, violence to capture stealing and coercion as well. But there's a trap here, right? Where we've now vested the authority to violence to one group, and then they now have this weird incentive to use that position to violate other people's property. So how do we escape that trap?
So the question is, do they, right? Do they have that incentive? And the argument would be they don't, right? So first of all, we don't want to give them the means, and the means traditionally that's been given to government to expand its power is the ability to intervene in our lives, right? So the founders did a pretty good job in America in limiting the scope of government, but they left lots of loopholes. Lots of them. Like, Thomas Jefferson starts the first public educational institution, right after they have a constitution. So there's a loophole for education. There's a loophole for economics. There's a loophole for banking. There's a loophole for trade. There's loophole for using coercion for taxation. There are lots of loopholes. And we still did pretty well in history of the last 250 years. I mean, a lot of wealth and a lot of happiness was generated as a consequence of the relative freedom America generated. Imagine if we could form a constitution and a government without those loopholes. That truly limited, it would be an institution that was limited in its scope, very clearly, very explicitly, without those loopholes that allowed them to come in and touch our lives. And also imagine a society in which there was understanding about what the role of government is. Right? There's never been one. right? There's 1,000 of us who understand the role of government in the world today. Maybe 10,000, maybe 100,000. I don't know, but it's nothing. It's a speck. But imagine millions of people who truly understand what the role of government is. And, I think the founders understood that you don't stay free unless you value freedom. You don't, government will not stay limited unless people want it to be limited. And it's up to our vigilance to keep it that way. So you can't create a system that's better than the people under it for very long. So our real goal is to educate people about the appropriate role of morality, why violence is bad for them, and why coercion is bad. Educate them about the proper role of government, and then they have to be vigilant in keeping it that way. But I don't think you can substitute any other institution for government in terms of preserving the peace. I think any other solution, including, I think, the various anarchist proposals that are being made, I think it's not hard to see how they deteriorate into a state of violence. They incentivize violence. They incentivize force much more than a government does. So there, even the vigilance of the people wouldn't help because they're fragmented and splintered into interest groups.
So let's assume then that we had restructured the Constitution and sealed these loopholes. We had an ideal Constitution, whatever that is, assuming that's even possible. And so we form a government based on this loophole-free Constitution. We vest the power in them. What ensures their adherence to that Constitution? And then what can people do if they overstep or overreach? Like how do the governed express their vigilance if government oversteps its bounds?
I mean, a few things. One is, and again, the founders were very good at this. One is you divide up power so that you don't vest power in any one institution of government, but you create a balance. In the United States, we basically have 4 institutions that are supposed to balance each other out, and we're really, if you think about how they constructed it, it was really thoughtful, right? The House of Representatives is the populist, the Senate, and senators were not elected. Senators were appointed by state legislatures. So the Senate, which is more, if you will, removed from the population, less likely to be inflamed by the population. Then you have an executive branch that can veto what these 2 houses have to agree, which is rare in a proper government. And then the president has to agree because he can veto them. And then there's a separate entity that's completely independent that then can veto their veto, right? They can veto everything that they did if they say it's inconsistent with the Constitution. That's a very clever way of doing it. And then, of course, to the extent that there are elections, that's part of how we express our vigilance. Somebody steps out of bounds. I don't know, John Adams supports the, something in Sedition Act. And we say, whoa, that's not consistent with the Constitution. That's not consistent with what we thought the government was. Now, I think in a properly understood system, that would have never passed, and the Supreme Court would have ruled it unconstitutional, killed it. But voters then have a chance to say, no, Adams, you're out because you violated your oath to the Constitution, and we choose to elect you. And of course, the ultimate way in which you hold the government accountable, more difficult today, I think, than in that distant past, is the right to rebel. Right, the right to basically revolution. That's not a right to revolution because nobody's going to recognize that right. It's your ability to say, I'm not. We are taking up arms against our own government. Now, I think in modern world with tanks and F-15s and atom bombs, that's a tough one. So we better get all the other pieces really, really tight and really, really good, because you don't want to revert to that one. It becomes super bloody.
Right. Is money involved in here at all? Like to have convertibility to gold or any type of money that's independent of government control? Is that a mechanism?
Yeah, the fact that the Constitution allows government to mint coin. Is a real problem, right? That's one of those big loopholes. Because once, as you talk about all the time, once you control money, You control the lifeblood of the economy. You control everything. One of the things that U.S. government did a lot in the 19th century, while there was relatively free banking, because it was still heavily regulated, they would switch between gold and silver, and they would change the convertibility, and they would, and so they created uncertainty, and they created different reserves. And banks, instead of being free, would have to buy government bonds, and that's how the government funded its deficits. Would force the banking system to buy its bonds and consider that as good as gold in a sense. So what you get is, once you allow them to control the currency, once you allow them to control money, you've given them control over the economy. And to me, one of the most important things you have to do in a proper constitution, in a revised constitution, is to separate all aspects of government from the economy. Government has no business in business, no business in the economy. Money is a private creation to be created by banks or by whoever wants. I don't care who creates the money. Banks are the natural, but it could be a new institution that we've never even imagined, or it could be created on a blockchain. Wherever money is created, let the market decide. I mean, in my view of Bitcoin at the end of the day is, I might have a personal view, but who cares, right? Nobody cares what Yaron thinks. What really matters is, what does the market choose? In a free market, if the market chose Bitcoin as money, then Bitcoin is money. Let there be competing currencies and let the best currency win. But once the government could say something like, because I think taxes should be voluntary, the government wouldn't really have a preference in how it accepted, it would have to, it might have, 10 forms of currency the government accepted for contributions towards it, because it would need to exchange those into something that it could buy goods and services with. But it should not be anywhere close to the banking system or anywhere close to the monetary system. It should be completely separated. And since it wasn't from the beginning, the Constitution was flawed in significant ways from the beginning.
Right.
As good of a document as it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I'm going to try to arc this.
I think money evolved through private transactions. I don't think government created money. Government took over money once it realized the power it had and how it could use it both for marketing purposes and for control over the economy. But money developed from our need to trade and the inefficiency of barter. And somebody came up with the idea, and who knows what they used in the beginning. They used all kinds of things. And we know from relatively primitive societies that still use all kinds of things as money. So lots of things can be money. There's no metaphysical commandment. Gold shall be money, right? If somebody finds an asteroid that's one big piece of gold, that's not, that's pretty inflationary, and that's probably not a really good, although it's pretty expensive to mine. But, let the market decide what makes sense as money. Money might change over time. It has. Silver for a period was money, and that was turned away. Tobacco was money in the Carolinas, before the United States was created. Lots and lots and lots of things throughout history have been used as money, and who knows what money will look like 100 years from now, if freedom is allowed, right? If we're allowed to experiment with money and be able to choose our own money.
Yeah, no, I agreed completely on that. Just the market should decide, and if it doesn't, you've got a problem, right?
And we've had a problem for most of human history because the market hasn't decided.
Right.
Government has injected itself into money since the kings figured out that they could put their little stamp on these coins, and they could chip away at the gold and tell you it was an ounce when it wasn't really an ounce, and they could hoard the gold for themselves, and all kinds of shenanigans governments has played with money, and when the money lenders, when the governments owed a lot of money to the money lenders, well, let's go out and kill the money lenders and we solved that problem. I don't owe them any money anymore. And a lot of the killing of Jews in the Middle Ages was a result of the fact that princes and kings owed money to the Jews. So they figured, let's go kill them. Then we don't have to pay them back.
Wow. So this whole idea of corrupting, confiscating, clipping, inflating money, it's been a driver of a lot of evil.
Absolutely. And if you go back to the most ancient coinage, not private coinage, but government coinage, it goes back to to some extent or another at the beginning of time. And yes, the seeking of money for the sake of money, the seeking of power through money has driven a lot of evil in the world.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. So in Rand's view, then, an animal can only really do good, right? Because they're only expressing behaviors that are consistent with life. As you said, not many animals are going to kill themselves, right? So,
and in that sense, there is no good and evil for them in a sense, because good and evil assume, in a sense, right, free will. They assume choice.
Right.
Since animals don't choose, whatever they do, right? And you could have said, oh, if that deer had taken a left turn over there instead of a right turn, it would have avoided a lion.
Right.
But it didn't have a choice, right?
Right. Consciousness is a double-edged sword in a way, because we get this capacity for, we can have expanded good, right? We can create ideas of justice and freedom and all of this, or we can actually turn reason against itself even, right? You can commit suicide, you can torture people, you can do all these evil things. So
that's no reason, right? That's a negation. I'd say that's a negation of reason. That's ignoring.
Well, I'm sorry, consciousness. I'm thinking of the thing that
Absolutely.
man has.
Human beings are capable of evil, whereas animals are not. Animals
as a
don't
result of dealing with concepts and time, right?
As a result of the fact that they have free will and they're conceptual beings, that opens up the possibility of evil in addition to opening up good.
So this ought versus is, which I'll read an excerpt about, it only exists for the conceptual being. It doesn't really exist for the perceptual being.
That's right. That's right. So the whole field of morality, the whole field that she's talking about here, ethics, does not exist for a non-conceptual being. It assumes, presupposes ability to conceive and an ability to choose, an ability to initiate the process of thought, which is what free will is about.
So Rand writes, in answer to those philosophers who claim that no relation can be established between ultimate ends or values and the facts of reality, let me stress the fact that living entities exist and function necessitates the existence of values and of an ultimate value, which for any given living entity is its own life. Thus, the validation of value judgments is to be achieved by reference to the facts of reality. The fact that a living entity is determines what it ought to do. So much for the issue of the relation between is and ought. So she's asserting, I guess whatever is consistent to the furtherance of one's own life is both the is and the ought.
Well, what is life, and what is your nature as a living being. And here the question is, well, what is human nature? What is the essence of human nature? And she would say, well, the essence of human nature, she goes on to say, is that we are a conceptual being, right? We're the rational being. We're the thinking being. In other words, we're a conceptual being. And therefore, what ought you do is determined by what you are. Since you're the rational being, what you ought to do is be rational, is to live up to your nature, is to follow your nature, right? A lion is, I don't know, a lion is strong and powerful, right? And that's what it ought to do, express its strength and power in eating other animals. We're the thinking being, and therefore what we ought to do is think, and think in pursuit of what? In pursuit of life, in pursuit of our life. So again, that's the is. The is the life of a rational being. And then the question is, how should a rational being live? By reason, by using his mind.
And so that, it makes sense. But then you look at human nature historically, and it seems like we're wrestling between our animality and our civility.
Very much so.
And in the longest arc of history, we're becoming more civil by and large, on average. It's amazing to me sometimes when I go into a city and just see how many strangers are getting on with one another. Like, we've actually created something pretty amazing that people.
Yeah, and think about the technology. Think about the technology we're using right now. Think about the skyscrapers. Think about the amazing stuff that human beings have created, and it's all a product of rationality, of reason, of thinking, planning. None of it just happened because somebody had an instinct to build a skyscraper. It all required actually sitting down with math and design and knowledge of materials and knowledge of all these things, and designing something and building something. So using your conceptual faculty generates massive values, generates amazing things. And the animalistic side of us generates violence. It generates destruction. It generates horror. But to access our conceptual faculty is an achievement. It requires effort. It requires the knowledge that one can do it, and the willingness to do it. It requires certain effort and work. And in past cultures, thousands of years ago, it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear what it was for, what could be achieved. It wasn't clear what the nature of human beings was. I mean, think about the cavemen. They were just starting to form concepts. It was still starting to build the conceptual language, the conceptual understanding of the world. Right? So it's going to take a long time. It took a long time, and of course, then you get diversions where, for long periods of time, people believe that a conceptual faculty is somehow mystical, is in some way mystical, and that our concepts come from revelation, or according to Plato, there's some other world where the pure form of our concepts live, and we're relating to that. So this understanding that our concepts relate to the things in reality, chairs are chairs. There's no such thing as chairness in some other world, but it's something that human beings can understand about a chair. That is an achievement. That's a conceptual achievement. That's philosophy. So it is a process. And once in a while, you get these diversions where the process gets sidetracked. You get a dark ages where we backtrack. But overall, in the long arc of history, we are slowly learning to appreciate our minds, to understand how they work, and to apply them to living a better life, living the best life that we as human beings can live. And one always is worried about backtracking, and about when you see in the world around us today, for example, people who advocate for backtracking, advocate for us becoming more animals and becoming less human. Because that's what it's all about, is, are we going to live up to being human, or are we going to backtrack to be animals? And there's an interesting, Jordan Peterson does this thing about the Bible. He does these Bible lectures, and he talks a lot. He talks quite often about Adam and Eve, and the Garden of Eden. And to me, the story of the Garden of Eden is actually opposite of what I think most religious people take it to be. To me, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are animals. They can't reason. Indeed, they haven't eaten from the tree of knowledge. It's a tree of knowledge, symbolizing reason. They haven't eaten from it. They're just animals. They're just there. They don't do anything with their lives. It really is kind of, they're not thinking, they're not producing, they're not creating. They're taking care of the animals. They're gardening a little bit, but there's no sex even, because Adam doesn't see Eve as a value, or the other way around, because only after they eat the apple do they want to cover themselves up, which I think is a symbol for sex. There's just living as animals. Maybe they have sex, but sex doesn't mean anything to them. Then once Eve and Adam eat from the tree of knowledge, then they become human. They become truly human. And to me, this is man's evolution to a state of being able to choose, being able to guide his life, being able to engage in productive activity, being able to engage in meaningful sex, being able to value the other sex in some meaningful way. To me, it's a parable of the transition between human beings as animals into human beings now as human beings, as thinking, choosing, living, planning beings, beings of cognition.
Right. So eating from the tree of knowledge represented the transition of humans into conceptual beings.
Yes.
But in that transition, there it's a double-edged sword again, right? It's almost like we had to learn the nature of evil, I guess, across history to even strive towards the good.
But look, we survived as a species. We survived, and it's not that it's a double-edged sword, because there's nothing good on the other side. Yes, there's no evil on the other side, but there's nothing good.
What I'm saying is, if it's an evolutionary process and we come out of animality, there's always going to be some tendency to be, oh, let me just take the guy's food real quick. And like you almost can't learn about the long-term consequences until you engage in the act of evil. I'm not talking about any individual necessarily. I'm talking about us learning across time.
I agree. So we had to make mistakes through history.
Mm-hmm.
You think by the 21st century, or by a few 100,000 years into the existence of human beings, we'd have figured most of it out. But it turns out that it's hard. It turns out that that these ideas are not easy. Think about this: philosophy, the idea of thinking conceptually about the world, right, is new, right? It's probably 5,000 years old, maybe a little less. Even the Old Testament, which is the first kind of book of an attempt to grapple with the nature of existence and the nature of reality and explaining things in terms of one God versus all these multiple gods that even that is what 3,000-4,000 years old. I mean, that's nothing. We've probably been around on Earth over 100,000 years. So as Homo sapiens, so 5,000 years of philosophy, of thinking, of trying to make sense of the world, we're still a young species, in other words. And there's still a lot for us to figure out. I think we figured out a lot. I think Ayn Rand does a lot of heavy lifting here, does a lot of work for us here. I wish more people took it seriously, particularly more philosophers and more thinkers took it seriously. But it's going to take a while until we internalize this and we live up to our potential. We live up to being human, which is a challenge, is to live up to being human rather than down to being an animal.
Yeah.
That's the conflict that exists in the world. Human beings being animals or human beings being human.
Right. And it's up to us to choose, basically. And see, okay, there's an accumulation game here too, right? We're accumulating learnings and concepts and principles over time. We're passing these, they have to be passed on clearly, intergenerationally. That's, mythology and narrative and even great works of philosophy, like what Ayn Rand's doing here. And we evolved to become conceptual beings, but it seems like we're still on that evolutionary track. Like we're trying to transcend our animality still. But now I look at the world and see things like the central bank, really preying on property rights. I mean, are we just having to go through this lesson of pain again? Like you can't print money to solve problems. I mean, because that in and of itself is a violation of property. So it's more animalistic than it is civilized.
But that's what people have to learn. People have to learn that property is what civilization is a core value of civilization.
Right.
Property is a core value of peace. That if they want to live peaceful, productive, happy lives, we have to defend property. We have to protect property. That's one thing they have to learn. Then they have to learn that central bank is a violation of that. That's a whole other conceptual kind of connection, right? And then they have to figure out how to get rid of the central bank, which is a whole other political kind of project, right? Yeah. So it's none of this is simple. It's frustrating because you think we would have learned already. But again, the United States was created 250 years ago. I think the greatest country ever created. Still not perfect, but a big jump forward. It's only 250 years old versus 5,000 years. So John Locke wrote about individual rights and property rights, of the centrality of property rights, importance of property rights. What is it? 300 years ago. That's like that in history, right? So for 300 years, and we've moved from, animals evolve biologically, and it can take a long time for them to evolve. We don't really evolve biologically. There's people who have stupid ideas don't die off, partially because we feed them, partially because we have healthcare and medicine, and we don't let people die off. So the only way to evolve is through culture, through education, through philosophy, through ideas. So ideas are now the way we evolve. And that's why, what we're doing, educating people about property rights, educating people about the purpose of life, educating people about reason and rationality. That's the way culture will ultimately evolve towards the right ideas. Mm-hmm. But just like in biological evolution could take hundreds, thousands of years really, this evolution of ideas can take decades,
right?
And maybe even centuries. So ultimately, I think our ideas will win. It's ultimately I'm worried about how long.
Yeah, no, it's point well taken. And that educational effort across history is always at odds with individual incentives and individual short-sightedness and inexperience, right? Some guy comes to power in his 20s. He just thinks I'm all that in a bag of chips. He doesn't care about evil or these long-run consequences.
And I've even met people with good ideas, people in Silicon Valley who think that, who think that we don't have to engage with ideas in education because technology will solve it all. And that's when I talk about the fact that ideas shape history and the fact that I don't think Bitcoin can win unless we have the right ideas. That's what worries me. It worries me that the people who basically are on our side, right, in a sense that they want freedom and they think it'll just happen.
Right.
And where they have both visibility and profile and status and money to help make it happen, it's a shame that they're not actively engaged in the battle for ideas, which I think is essential to make the battle over central bank, the battle over currency, the battle over money, the battle over property a reality.
Yes,
eventually a reality.
So let's zero in on that, on the printing of money, because this is one I've described this as like the recurrent self-deception of humanity. We've learned the lesson. I mean, countless times we've learned it rationally. It's been deduced from axioms by the Austrians. It's been empirically experienced across history. Yet the lesson does not seem to stick. Like it seems to stick for some amount of time, and then a few generations later, we're back at it. Here we are again, worldwide, back at it.
There's nothing special about that. Think about all experiences. Socialism never worked. Even before we had a word for socialism, it didn't work. The 15th century had communes that failed, right? Communes have never worked. Voluntary communes, coercive communes, doesn't matter. Communal living is not sustainable. It never works. Socialism never has worked, yet people want to try it over and over again. I would argue that a morality, Ayn Rand here is advocating for a morality of self-interest. I would argue that a morality of altruism, a morality of sacrifice, a morality of living for other people is something that will keep trying. It usually leads to death and destruction. Statism, nationalism lead to death and destruction, yet nationalism is on the rise all over the world right now. So human beings don't learn from experience. They learn from experience. Unfortunately, their learning from experience is always dependent on the philosophy they bring to the table with them. And since most of the philosophy that exists in the world around us is a philosophy that is not attached to reality, doesn't view reality as the ultimate judge, what's right and wrong, good or bad, workable, not workable. So people might in their business life, in their work life, view reality that way, but then they go and in their personal life, in their political life, in their philosophical beliefs, they're detached completely from reality, which is what Plato taught people. Then it's impossible. Then it's not surprising that we keep trying, and they keep saying, "Look, we know it hasn't worked, but next time we're going to get closer to Platonic ideal. Next time we'll do it right. Next time we'll figure it out. Next time we'll and you'll hear people saying, particularly religious people, well, there's no such thing as perfection. We're all flawed. So we keep trying until we get it better. But what's the alternative? Just to leave it up to self-interested markets. We don't believe in self-interest. Self-interest is evil. We know that. We've been taught that from when we were 2 years old. So this is why philosophy is so important, right? We're not going to stop the printing of money until we change people's view of the nature of man, our conceptual ability, reality as a standard of what's true and what's not. Reality as the guide, and your own self-interest as noble rather than evil.
Mm.
And if we can change those views, then money, as you said, money printing is easy. Who was the stupid person who tried to print money for the whole economy? I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. But to get to the point where people, like, to me, when I read Ayn Rand and I read all this philosophy, when I read the Austrians, it was like, yeah, of course. It was like, once you get the philosophical concepts, once you get the principles, the application in economics, yeah, well, of course. This is why I think what really is needed out there is philosophical education rather than economic education. We've got great economists. We've had them. You named some of them, but even the Milton Friedmans and the Adam Smith, who might not have been perfect and might not have been von Mises, right? They were pretty good, and yet nobody listened, and nobody seems to care. And even though they've been right, every one of their predictions comes true.
Right.
Nobody cares. Because that's not what matters to them. They've created an ideal that is detached from reality, and that's what needs to be challenged.
So, I mean, are not the philosophical foundations of Western civilization life, liberty, property? Like, what are we missing?
I don't think, I think that the philosophical foundations of Western civilization, I think, are reason and individualism. But neither reason nor individualism were completely embraced, and neither reason nor individualism were properly understood. So immediately after the Enlightenment, which is the birth of Western civilization, there's a counter-Enlightenment led by Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer and Marx and ultimately Nietzsche. And they all are fighting against the idea of reason and individualism. And they're making convincing cases, and people are buying it. This is why it's within the West that communism comes out. It's within the West that we get fascism. It's in the West that we get central bankers and the sophistication of central bankers. Because there's always this, in Western civilization, unfortunately, there's still these negative forces that harken back to the Dark Ages and to Plato. Plato is the real villain. To Plato in the Dark Ages that keep, challenging reason and individualism. And since in the Enlightenment, they didn't ground those concepts properly. They were weak. They are being eaten up. This is why I think Ayn Rand is so important. I think Ayn Rand takes the ideas of the Enlightenment and grounds them, gives them foundations, gives them the proper philosophical defense. And I think if she is taken more seriously, that's when we can move on. That's when we can actually start seeing real changes in the culture.
Interesting. So we're still growing up. Basically,
we're still growing up. We're still kids. We're still children.
Hey guys, I hope you found this episode valuable. At the What is Money Show, we are striving to deliver the most valuable knowledge possible in each and every episode. However, as Aristotle said, the purpose of knowledge is action, not knowledge. So I hope you're deriving some useful knowledge from the show, and I hope it's improving the actions you are taking in your life. Speaking of action, if you want to dive deeper into the big ideas explored in this show, please sign up for my newsletter titled The Freedom Analects at breedlove22.substack.com. Also, have you bought your tickets for Bitcoin 2022 in Miami yet? If not, it's your lucky day, as I am giving away 10 million sats, which is roughly $4,000 US, to one lucky person who buys a conference ticket through my affiliate link. My affiliate link can be found on my Twitter profile at breedlove22, which also has a link. My Twitter profile has a link to my link tree, which you can also visit my link tree directly for links to all my work, including Bitcoin 2022 affiliate sales. My link tree is linktr.ee/breedlove22. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys watching the show. I hope you're finding some valuable knowledge in the What is Money Show, and I'll see you back here again next time.